Congratulations on finishing your first essay. Now that you've written about a work of art or a visual text in a full-length essay, it's time to go a bit deeper in our analysis and learn some more advanced strategies for understanding what is going on in a work of art or a visual text. This lesson introduces strategies for rhetorically analyzing metaphors and analogies in written and visual arguments. I'll show how, by highlighting certain aspects of a concept while hiding others, analogies and metaphors change how we think about a concept and the connotations and values we associate with it. Let's begin by returning to the short clip from Clueless that we examined previously.
But it's like when I had this garden party for my father's birthday, right? I said RSVP because it was a sit-down dinner. But people came that did not RSVP.
Let's see how this argument is working logically. In Cher's analogy, the house is America. The invited guests are the American citizens who already are supposed to be at the party. The uninvited guests, those who did not RSVP, are the Haitians. The food and place settings are like our national resources, and so on. So how do these similarities make an argument? Well, if we rewrote Cher's argument into something like standard form, we might get something like this. There is an unspoken rule or premise that says, as long as two things are basically the same kind of thing, we should act consistently in both situations, especially in terms of our moral values. Then Cher says, garden parties require us to act hospitably. And in another premise, she's arguing through the analogy that immigration is like hosting a garden party. So we get a conclusion that says we should really act hospitably in the situation of immigration. Arguments by analogy revolve around the principle that two things which resemble one another in a number of respects will resemble each other in further unconfirmable respects. This kind of argument only works if two rules hold. First, that the two things being compared have significant and relevant parallelism. And secondly, that there are no pertinent dissimilarities relative to the argument it is being used to make. If the analogy violates one of these rules, it's called a false analogy. But the tricky thing is that analogies always are comparing dissimilar, unequivalent things. So whether when an analogy is working and when an analogy is breaking one of these rules and it is a false analogy is really a matter of judgment. Everyone knows that two things in an analogy are never going to be exactly the same. There's always going to be differences. So when we're arguing with analogies, the question is really about whether they are similar enough in the most relevant ways to warrant the comparison. But actually, what I want to point out for the moment is that even when analogies are faulty, they are often effective because they create metaphorical associations between the two concepts. Metaphors help us see things in new ways. Metaphors create new connections and build conceptual maps for our minds about how the world works. Metaphors appeal to our senses, our sense of experience and emotions. They evoke other concepts which have positive or negative connotations for us. To get a better sense of what's going on, let's think about how metaphors work a little more closely. We learn what things are like through metaphors. Most commonly, we use metaphors to try to understand what an abstract or complex concept is like by comparing it to a simpler, more concrete concept, something that we have direct experience of. Sometimes the more familiar concept is called the vehicle, and the new concept, the one being explained, is called the tenor. The vehicle and the tenor can be stated or implied. For instance, all of these constructs are using the same basic metaphor that a ballerina is a swan. Even in these last two examples, when we just compare one part of the ballerina to one part of the swan, it still works to imply the whole concept, the whole comparison of swan and ballerina. This is an important and interesting thing about metaphors, that with just one little piece of the hint of what the metaphor is, of what the two things are being compared, we can extrapolate, by extension, all the other implied parts of the metaphor. For example, here's a sentence from William Deresiewicz talking about what it's like working in a bureaucracy. He says, "The head of the bureaucracy I was a part of, the chairman of my academic department, had that exact same smile, like a shark, and that exact same ability to make you uneasy." So this one little phrase, like a shark, is all we need to build out the comparison that he is implying. The department chair is like a shark. That makes the students or the chair's co-workers like the prey. And maybe the academic environment is like the ocean. And the shark is hunting the prey, and the prey is scared. All these parts of the metaphor work perfectly, automatically, and easily in our minds when we see little metaphoric associations like this. This is called metaphoric extension. We don't need to name all the parts of the metaphor or all the aspects of the parallel in the analogy. We just need to name one or two parts, and the reader will fill out the rest. Metaphors are conceptual, not just poetic or decorative or linguistic. They're creating conceptual maps and giving us a structure about how to see the world. These conceptual maps are only partial. No metaphor is a perfect analogy. So it's not like a mathematical equation in which each side of the equal sign is assumed to have exactly the same meaning. Instead, metaphors are drawing comparisons between unlike things. So even when we say something like a ballerina is a swan, we don't mean it really. Ballerinas, of course, are not swans. Rather, the metaphor is pointing out certain similarities that the writer wants to highlight. The parts of the comparison that don't fit simply get ignored or treated as unimportant. They don't invalidate the comparison, they are simply being suppressed. This unique process of emphasizing similarity and de-emphasizing difference is known as highlighting and hiding. Metaphors highlight certain aspects of concepts while hiding others. The metaphor focuses our attention on certain similarities between two things and ignores aspects that are inconsistent with the analogy. The ballerina is a swan highlights, for instance, the aesthetic quality of the ballerina's body. It's thin and tall, like a swan's neck. The ballerina's neck is very distinctive and sinewy. Maybe the manner of movement of the ballerina, which is elegant, smooth, and expressive like a swan swimming on a lake. But on the other hand, this metaphor hides things. What about the ballerina swan metaphor does not fit? Well, swans have curved necks, but ballerinas have straight necks. Swans live in nature, ballerinas live in theaters. This metaphor helps us appreciate ballerinas aesthetically, and it doesn't seem dangerous. But other metaphors do need to be analyzed for what they are highlighting and hiding, because they can shape our assumptions about a concept. And without us realizing it, we can adopt the values that the metaphor implies. For example, in the early 1900s, it was very popular for journalists to use horse race analogies when writing about political elections. You have probably heard of phrases like, "the candidates entered the race." "She is the Democrats' dark horse candidate." "The Democrats do not yet have a clear front runner." all those phrases I just read highlight certain aspects of the racehorse analogy, but other things are being hidden. Most importantly, the horse race analogy for politics leaves out what the candidates' platforms and values and policies are. What is left out is that the voters, I guess who are the spectators watching the race, are actually deciding which horse wins by voting on the candidates, and they vote based on their policies. All of that part of how the voting system actually works is being left out of this analogy. In their groundbreaking book, Metaphors We Live By, Lakoff and Johnson observe that languages develop elaborate, coherent ways of talking about one concept in terms of another. And when we talk about one idea metaphorically in terms of another idea, the metaphor becomes a model for how we understand that idea. Their first example, Argument is War, shows us that most of the ways we talk about arguments in our society is in terms of warfare. Your claims are indefensible. He attacked the weak point in my argument, and so on. The very important metaphor in our society, time is money, highlights the fact that, like money, time is a limited resource. On the other hand, time is not money, and in a lot of ways it doesn't fit. If you spend your time trying to do something and it doesn't work, you can't get your time back. By adopting this metaphoric concept for thinking about time, our culture has taught us to think about time in a certain way, as if it were money, as if it were a liquid commodity that we can exchange. The metaphoric concept, by highlighting certain aspects and hiding others, embeds this concept within our value system. So let's return now to the example from Clueless and think about how we can use the concept of highlighting and hiding to analyze what's going on in an argument by analogy or metaphor. What is Cher's analogy highlighting? Meeting people is fun. It's a party. It's great to meet new people. Why not invite more people to a party? It's also highlighting that it is quite generous and hospitable to welcome in immigrants. That is certainly true. And that we can adjust our resources if we work at it. But her analogy also implies that the adjustment of process is going to be somewhat simple and relatively pain-free. You just go to the kitchen and rearrange some things, she says. It's improvisational. It's relatively painless. What does her analogy hide? Well, the party analogy disguises the fact that when immigrants move into a new country, they don't socialize very easily or quickly. There might be a language barrier, for instance, or different value systems. The party analogy also disguises the fact that this is not a temporary stopover. Immigration implies permanently joining a community. So the better analogy might be having someone move into your house, not just come as a guest for a party, and so on. Once we've identified the things in the analogy that are being highlighted and the things being hidden, we can better interrogate the validity of the analogy and analyze the rhetorical effect. Why is Cher hiding these aspects of the analogy? Do any of the hidden aspects seriously undermine the strength of her argument? We might argue that, yes, in fact, there are very important, significant dissimilarities between hosting a party and immigration, and we could therefore critique her analogy as being logically faulty or weak. Now let's look at how metaphors work in visual rhetoric to try to persuade viewers to see equivalencies between things. Here is a fairly prototypical advertisement for Chanel perfume. All we see is Catherine Deneuve, a celebrity model, and a bottle of Chanel perfume. How is this advertisement working to persuade us? intuitively we know that Chanel wants us to associate their product with this beautiful model. And they've hinted at that through the way they've arranged this image. Notice how Catherine and the bottle of Chanel have certain visual similarities to them. First of all, they're both elegantly black and white. They're sort of bright in certain areas, the glass of the perfume bottle and the eyes of Catherine's eyes. So the image is working through a process of metaphoric transfer. It's putting two things side by side, Catherine and the perfume bottle, and using visual rhetoric or compositional elements to draw an equivalency or an analogy between them. When you're looking for metaphors working in visual arguments, you might look for things like the color or the tone of certain objects being the same, and mostly you're looking for the spatial arrangement of the image, hints or clues that say, this is supposed to be associated with this. This is like this. There's only two things in this image. And so just by that fact alone, we're in a close-up shot of Catherine. There's nothing else in the image. It's just her face and the bottle of perfume. We can infer that these two things belong together in some way. They are the same in some way. And so that's the metaphoric transfer happening. They want you to associate the qualities of Catherine, beauty, celebrity status, luxury, elegance, youth, all the things that Catherine expresses with their product, Chanel. What about this image? Now, I don't know if you can make out exactly what the image is on the top, but if you make out on the left the long brown hair, you can see it is the silhouette of the back of a naked woman. And if you look at the image for a moment, you start to see how strategically Ferrari's photographers and ad designers arranged this image with the lighting coming from above and lighting up just one top side of each image. And think about the choice of these three objects. Why a bottle of wine and a beautiful nude woman in relationship to this Ferrari? Clearly, you can start to put together how the argument here is supposed to work. If you want a lifestyle that is characterized by beauty and by elegance or sophistication, maybe represented by the wine bottle, then you will also enjoy a Ferrari. But there's even more to it going on than that. Consider how the shape of each of these objects are visually similar. They're all curvaceous and long and slender horizontally. So it is a visual clue to our eyes. These three things actually do visually look similar in certain ways. So Ferrari has used those compositional clues to suggest to us, to hint to us that these three things are actually not just arbitrarily being put in this advertisement. No, they're actually here because they somehow go together in some way. You see this strategy of metaphoric transfer a lot in advertisements. You don't see it as much in classical art, but one place you do see it is symbolic and allegorical art. Returning just briefly to this image of Lady Liberty guiding the army in the French Revolution, we might see here what's going on in a new way when we think about metaphoric transfer. Lady Liberty is a woman. She's young. She's pure. Her topless nudity implies that she's actually a pure, chaste figure in this case, because she's so pure that, like the Garden of Eden, she is not afraid of her nakedness. So all of these qualities are actually being transferred by her association with the French army that is behind her, that she's leading. And if it's interesting to notice that the men and the boys in the army do not have these qualities. They are not young, beautiful, brightly lit up by the sun and the other lighting in the image. They are not heavenly. She's sacred or from heaven. They lack all those qualities. But by putting Lady Liberty in the midst of them, the idea here is metaphoric transference. They actually are partaking or participating or are actually revealed to be characterized by the same qualities of Lady Liberty. Okay, that's all for now. In your metaphor practice set for this week, you are going to practice identifying and analyzing metaphoric arguments in both written and visual texts. I look forward to seeing your work and to continue reading your essays as well as reading your new observation journal analysis at the end of this week. I'll see you next week.